Well, welcome. Lots of people, 74 people have joined us today for today's webinar about digital certificates of analysis and other transfers of quality test result data between organizations in the pharmaceutical life cycle. We are the Digital Integration of Sponsor and Contract Organizations program, called DISCO for short, and in particular a sub-team that's been looking at digital certificates of analysis, part of BioPhorum, which I think you're all member companies of. Please participate throughout. The chats that you've just been using, you can make comments, you can ask questions, you can start talking about topics you want to discuss. You might just want to say, that's a really good point, that's fine to do that. And in between the segments of our 8 speakers, I'll try and draw in some of those comments and questions just to keep it interactive as we go. And if at any point you like or want to react with applause or anything like that, do that. It always encourages the presenters. In fact, you'll see them smile if you do that, which is always a good thing. So today we have 8 speakers, each taking about 5 to 7 minutes, I hope, to tell part of this overall story. And these are all practitioners, and on the right you'll see there's other members of our team here with us, so please do use the chat because you'll get some responses, I hope. And this team covers sponsors and contract organizations and technology partners. In fact, in total there's 28 companies that have been part of the DISCO program. So first of all, Nick is going to set the scene by telling us about the context in the DISCO program and about certificates and digitalization and really why is this important. And Roland will be looking at all the different use cases throughout the supply chain, about 11, I think, lots of places where CoAs are used. And it really begs the question, shouldn't we do this in a common way? Morris is very familiar with the certificates, but he spots a problem. We've been using paper and PDFs, and he really knows those issues. And so he'll tell us about that. And Stephen, on the positive side, has a vision of what it should be like and sees benefits in going digital. And he's actually done that. So he's speaking from experience. They all are, actually. Heather is working out the process for creating CoAs for all her different customers. Jer has been looking at some of the emerging standards and also some of the bespoke ways we've been doing integration between our organizations, which members have shared in detail. And then David picks it up and compares some of those ways and sees what does our future solution need to look like in terms of a data model. Santul has built lots of integrations with other companies. And so he's going to tell us a bit about the challenges of realization, about how you actually build those things. So, Nick, would you like to tell us a bit about how this fits with your job and then about the context and DISCO, digitalization certificates, whatever you want to introduce us to?
Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Nick Leggin. I work at AbbVie, as it says on the slide. In our business technology solutions organization. In my current role, I'm responsible for supporting our external and contract manufacturing organizations. So as we move into the next few slides, the first one that I want to highlight is the universe of topics that came up as this DISCO forum came to be. As you can see here, there's 4 circles and lots of topics under those circles. We are all busy professionals and can't do all of these things concurrently. So for the purpose of today's discussion, we're going to narrow in specifically on quality testing and quality certificates. But you know, in my job, when I hear we want to automate data with our TPMs, as you can see, there's a lot of narrowing down that can happen on the topic of automating data. On the next slide, we want to show where this fits into the work overall that we're doing within DISCO. The rows across the top represent some of the foundational work that we're taking on to first set the vision, which was published within the last year on why we think this is important. We're also going to be developing a playbook on how do you actually develop a set of standards to improve the exchange between the sponsor and the contract organizations. But each of the columns or pillars represent a specific focus area that we're dedicating a sub-team and time and attention to. And as noted previously, we're focused right now on digital certificates of analysis and test results. There's another team that's working on digital deviations, and then there will be other sprints that evolve over time. So this is kind of how it fits in with our ways of working for the DISCO forum. On the next slide, I just want to level set quickly, and my colleagues will go into much better detail on this, but when we're talking about the certificate of conformance or certificate of analysis, it's really just to provide assurance to the customer or the regulator or to another stakeholder that you are getting what you're getting. There's typically header data that specifies what it is, where it was made, who made it, and then a series of specifications that have been agreed upon to say, yes, we've tested this, this meets our specifications, here it is, and then the receiving party may just store that for future use in case there's an audit. They may use the data in there for trend monitoring purposes, or they may be obligated to share this with another party downstream. So this is the paradigm that we're going to be looking at today. But let's now focus on why this. Why digitize certificates? I think to start with that, first of all, let's just ground ourselves in digitalization. Whenever I hear this word, I always think of a former kind of boss who would say, "I've had a digital watch for 40 years. Why are you saying digitization?" So it's more than that. It's a dangerous word, but it's really about how do you take non-value add activities from a well-defined process, making it more productive, taking inefficiencies out of the process, and almost more importantly, removing the opportunities for human error. With this, not only do you kind of de-risk certain processes or certain procedures, but you also open up kind of a reservoir, if done right, of data that can be used for lots of other decision-making purposes. So this is kind of how we're viewing the word digitization in this particular use case. So now let's go back to the certificate. A certificate is really a promise. We are giving you pure and quality materials, which will ultimately go into something that goes into the body of a patient. So it's very important because it establishes trust between the sending and the receiving parties. But not only is it important, it's pretty universal. Within our groups and even within the chat at the beginning of this session, everybody had these different examples. So we've all experienced this either as a sponsor or as a contract organization. So we're thinking about something that's important, and we're thinking about something that's somewhat universal. And the third part is there's already like information that we're scavenging today, in many cases, on these certificates. So let's combine those two together. And what we're doing is we're removing non-value add. We're trying to make more informed decisions. We're trying to increase efficiency on something that's really important and pretty universal in the biopharma space to ultimately benefit our stakeholders and our patients. Because at the end of all of this, there is a patient whose life will be transformed by the work that we're ultimately doing. And I think within the collection of people in our forum, we believe passionately about this, and it's been energizing to collaborate with all these other partners on trying to find kind of a better mousetrap to be able to do this. So now kind of taking a step back, and AbbVie is both a sponsor and a contract organization. And I've been in this role probably about 2.5 years. And one of the first things that I heard is every TPM is different, or every supplier is different. But are we really that different? Yes, we might be different from a digital maturity perspective. Yes, we might be different in how we want and receive the data. But as we've talked about this, the attributes really aren't that different. And all of these kind of places where the circles don't overlap is the potential for waste that's being generated. And when you take into account the number of suppliers or the number of customers that a supplier might work with, there's way more circles that can be represented on this page. So as you think about the next several presenters, the message is, why can't we overlap more in all of this?
Thank you so much, Nick. So the next question is, who are Party A, Party B, and Party C? Some of you have already answered this question in the chat, and I invite the rest of you to do so as well. Not just to introduce yourselves, but also because we are trying to validate and make sure there isn't a use case we haven't already thought of. And so please do add your comment, just sharing what type of organization you're from. Do you send or receive, and with who, with what type of partner? But now let me invite Roland to talk through the 11 or so use cases that we found. And on the way, just tell us why this is important to you as well. Go ahead, Roland.
My name is Roland Kleinmeier. I work at Roche Pharma in the Global Manufacturing Science and Technology function, where we're supporting the commercial manufacturing network in terms of the implementation of innovative technologies. In my role as a direct material expert, I'm serving as a digital translator for a number of different digital transformation projects. And I've been involved with certificates of analysis for the longest part of my career. Now, as we're talking about the numerous different use cases we're seeing for certificates of analysis, let's first go back to the highest level where everything looks very simple, where you can think of a material producer that makes some kind of material that's being used by a pharmaceutical manufacturer to actually produce a medicine that's then consumed by a patient, our end customer. Now, all of them have to trade information on their products. It's something that Nick pointed out. The COA is quite universal. But the important question here is, do they all have the same needs from this information? So as a raw material producer, you're quite early in the supply chain. Cost pressure and the need for efficiency is quite high. So they want to share as little know-how as possible while they keep their effort minimal. On the other hand, as a pharmaceutical producer, especially one that supplies life-saving or life-altering medicines to humans, improving compliance and compliance with the law and regulations, that's key to maintaining the license to operate. Then finally, for the end customer, and that's me and you as patients, we want to be sure that the medicine we're getting is safe, it's original, it hasn't been tampered with. And those are all of those things. If we move to the next slide, please, David, we can put that into a bold statement that summarizes the things that Nick already pointed out, where we can say that the certificate of analysis is the primary vehicle to confirm that a product has been made according to an agreed set of characteristics, and we call that the specification. In the next step, as we move from this high level to the real world, we see that it's very complex, intertwined, and it's also volatile. We're not dealing with one material producer, we're dealing with a diverse portfolio. These producers are located in many different countries, across various different industries, in different states of digital maturity, and they also have very diverse types of products. And they serve a globalized manufacturing network of sponsors and contract organizations. So there's not one pharmaceutical producer. There is a network of sponsors and contract organizations, which is also the focus of the DISCO program. And this network of manufacturing sites and specialist abilities in it serves a variety of different end customers. So there's patients, but there's also other end customers for the information that we're providing. And these customers are served by a multitude of different distribution channels. And if we try to map that out in something like a flow chart, we tried to do this here, and we came up with about 11 distinct use cases where we're saying this will be really distinct things which have characteristics that make them different from each other, and be aware that this value chain that we have here is representative. There are many variations to it, but as we discussed in this team, we were seeing that there's definitely the starting point of everything is a raw material supplier. And they use a certificate of analysis to give to their shipping partners or distributors. And the same is true for primary packaging suppliers. But that type of COA is distinctly different for certain reasons. Shipping partners and distributors often issue their own COAs to their customers. Can be a contract manufacturer, can be also a sponsor organization. And these manufacturers then, they're using contract labs in many cases, where again, a certificate of analysis is involved. And then in the internal relationship between a CMO and a sponsor organization, the natural flow of certificates would be from the contract manufacturer to the sponsor. But be aware that just as well, there is a flow of information back from the sponsor to the contract manufacturer. If you're thinking, for example, about active pharmaceutical ingredients that are provided by the sponsor to the CMO to make the final product, definitely we need a COA here. With sponsor organizations, of course, they're working again with distributors, but the information shared here is different from what we have in the beginning of the supply chain. And working with affiliates across the globe, we have requirements for local packaging, inspections, translation, and release procedures, where again, the certificate of analysis is key to making this happen. On the very right side, we see the last group of 3 distinct COA use cases. Uppermost on the right side, we see clinicians and patients. So they're the ones who administer and consume the medicine, respectively. That's what comes to mind first of all when you're thinking about the end customer and user of the medicine. But there's also a use case for certificates of analysis in customs, where it is used to check shipments and allow imports. And last but definitely not least, health authorities require certificates of analysis to be presented during submission and also during inspections. And taking all of this together, I think it becomes very clear that raw materials is a starting point. It's a very eminent use case for certificates of analysis, but there are many more, and they all have quite distinct characteristics in each case, which make it worthwhile to think about how can we harmonize what we're doing there. Going back to what Nick said about why can't we be all within this single circle that we're seeing.
Fantastic. And I noticed on that slide, primary packaging supplier was one of the actors. And a comment from Timothy Mayer in the chat: as a primary packaging supplier, stoppers and seals, he's seen many different solutions to digitize COA. We haven't actually had a primary packaging solution provider representing us, so I'm very interested later perhaps to see if there's any comments, but particular pain points that you see, Timothy. But just for now, I'm going to give you another question, not just to you, Timothy, but to everybody. What pain points do you see with certificates of analysis? And as you're thinking about that, just type some stuff into the chat so that we can see what comes out. Many of you have probably gone electronic in the sense of sending COAs as PDFs. And in the next segment, Morris has worked with processing PDF certificates and has some strong views, let's say. So let's watch this animation that he's put together.
Let's try to describe the problem in less than 5 minutes. Certificates of analysis are the compliant and accepted means to demonstrate that every movement of inputs, intermediates and finished goods have been controlled and tested to required quality. They're a key input to the review and approval for use of materials throughout the process. The data these documents contain is critical to control and safety, and our ability to share these data is critical to how well partners in a modern pharma supply chain collaborate with each other. Suppliers, contract manufacturing organizations, contract testing organizations, and sponsor organizations. But we have a problem. The vehicle is old. Manual processes remain the norm, and while certificates of analysis are now normally assembled from data in systems, the vehicle we use to share is most often a PDF, often scanned, often printed out again to review at the receiver end. And it's not stupid. We all need to be compliant, and regulators are deeply familiar and comfortable with the manual processes we capture in our SOPs to manage these essentially paper documents through creation, review, approval, and archiving. We follow the course of least resistance because, attractive though process improvement is, compliance is king. Therefore, PDFs remain ubiquitous as the vehicle of our data. But PDFs are effectively paper and glass, and paper is a prison for data. To get at the data, for any reason, you have to visit the prison. So we print out the document, we stick it in an in tray, we wait till we can get to it. We have to check that the data is correct. We may need to transcribe it to other systems. We may need to review that it meets specification for a particular application, gather evidence to support supplier or process management. The list goes on. All of these things are important processes, but these processes are designed around the problem of paper. Paper is a traffic jam for processes. We have delays in process start. We need second-person verification to trap human error. We have rework, delay, and with the data hard to use, processes which rely on it may be run less frequently than would be optimal if access was easy. For example, evaluating suppliers for reduced testing regimes. Cycle times are slow and sometimes volatile, and levels of inventory we have to hold to mitigate the associated elevated risk are higher than optimal. Slow processes are high effort, with high effort, are less environmentally sustainable. So surely it's obvious. Everyone moved to collaboration using structured data and the problem goes away. Sadly, we all agree in the principle, but doing it is not so simple. Modern pharma supply chains are complex with many suppliers, many nodes, and many relationships. Some of us can play the role of both receiver and supplier within a single supply chain. Most suppliers have many customers. All customers have many suppliers. The landscape where we need to solve the problem is one of many-to-many relationships, but nobody wants different processes in each of their many relationships. Both suppliers and receivers are reluctant to change to new ways of working for which many of their other partners are simply not ready, or who are themselves struggling with variations to data requirements in their own relationships. The investment required to change is considerable. Nobody wants their investment wasted, and perhaps more importantly, nobody wants to break something that works, however imperfect it is. We lack standard language, data standards, standard ways to share and to deliver data. Moving first is difficult, it's expensive and it's risky. What if others don't follow? How do we address that some countries and markets continue to insist on hard copies and wet signatures? The classical Greek dilemma is a problem with two choices, neither of which is unambiguously attractive, or both of which have a clear downside. Both horns are potentially painful, and we find ourselves on the horns of such a dilemma. Stick with PDFs, and the traffic jams remain. Or try to change, but it's simply not realistic that we can all change at the same time. Any solution must solve this dilemma and avoid those nasty horns, and the problem can thus be restated. How do you build an evolutionary path from multiple formats and different language and standards, where everyone can start where they are and grow at different speeds to a new structured data paradigm? How do you provide a path to grow from PDF to XML that lets our process keep working while we grow? And how do we bring the whole industry on a journey that gets the data out of paper prison and clears the process traffic jams in a way that works for everybody?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Maurice, for putting that together. Our paper is a prison for data, and so many analogies there. Oh, getting some little reactions going on here, and gratefulness for that explanation. Please do comment on what you find good, but I have a question for you. In that evolutionary path that Maurice has laid out in the chat, I've asked you, what would you most like to see transformed in this area of certificates? And have a little think about that. And Stephen, as he talks about the vision that he started to form and actually what he's started to do in his work, will start to set out some of the benefits and vision of that. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Wing. I am head of analytical and logistical services with Millipore Sigma. So we're not only a raw material supplier, but we also provide CMO and CTO services. So a lot of things and a lot of the applications that was shared earlier by Roland is something that actually fits into a lot of areas of our business. But what we're going to focus on next is as you look at technology implementation and trying to put in new innovative solutions, you really have to focus on specific applications and use cases. So we're going to share a couple of areas that we've been looking at in terms of the EC of A's, and the vision user stories that we focus on is starting with the release manager. So somebody that's responsible for releasing the product, either a finished product or raw material, into their operations for subsequent use. So what are they concerned about? They need to be able to confirm and verify the quality of the product, so that and some of the other things that were also mentioned, right? Is this the right product? Is it the right quantity? So there's a lot of things that have to be verified before it's released, but also that they can also see where does it come from, right? Is it which batch is it? So having this information is very important as you start to use the product. The next user story that we looked at was the data scientists. So when you look at your operations and you're looking at your production process, you might be able to see that there's some variability in your process. And to better understand that, you can use some of the same information that's currently used as we mentioned for quality purposes, but you can use it to look at what's happening in your process, what's driving the variability. So in order to do that, you might want to do some trending analysis, based on raw material information. And also, as you do that, you might be able to learn more about your process so that you can make it more efficient in the future. In addition, if you do have some deviations in your process, now having that data at your fingertips allows you to more quickly really go through your process of assessing the situation, understanding the root cause, and more importantly, getting the corrective actions in place. So this is kind of to illustrate not only the importance of focusing on specific use cases, but the fact that we are looking at one piece of information, the EC of A's, and you can use it in different ways. And that's the other significance of having digital data. It makes it easier for you to not only receive the information, but also to use it in different ways and different processes by different functions. So next slide, please. So when we look at the implementation of technology, it's not only the technology itself. So we're looking at, what are we trying to do in terms of the technology. So you have the technologies. In this case, we're talking about the certificates of analysis. So you want to understand where you are today. Do you have the digital maturity? Do you have the things in place to allow you to receive and also to generate these electronic files, and then to be able to safely and securely pass it on? There's huge benefits. Of course, you see there. I'm not going to read through all of them, but the key here is that you do have the significance, or I think intuitively everybody understands that digital is much better than paper, as illustrated by a lot of the things that have already been shared with you. But more importantly, it ties to your business objectives, right? And when you look at some of the business objectives of trying to reduce costs, increase speed, make sure that the quality is where it needs to be, having the agility, but also getting more visibility and better understanding so you can make better business decisions. And these are the real drivers. And it's not just the receiver, but it's also the provider of this information that can also get some of these benefits that's outlined here. Next slide, please. So what's already been mentioned is the importance also of standardization. How do we get into that same box? And so some of the things that we've been doing on the MilliporeSigma side is actually trying to, really lead into this direction, and specifically on the EC of A's. And so there's a number of things you can do, but most importantly, you have to have collaboration. And when you look at some of the and any type of technology and implementation, innovation, you always have what people refer to as the leaders, and then you have the fast followers, and then you have the laggards, right? So we've found some of those partners that are ready to start exchanging, and you have to do that so that you can start building and developing something that could be used across the industry. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what you don't want to do is to create customized solutions with each and every partner, because that's not sustainable. It's too costly, and you just can't really scale it from that point. And it's not going to be something that's universally shareable with your other partners. Next slide. So again, going paperless, is very important. We talked about some of the processes that might be used today in terms of scanning and being able to provide PDFs and so forth. But really, we're trying to when you look at that process, there's not only the manual steps that are taken. There's also the resources, it's the printers, it's the papers, it's the inks, electricity, and so forth. So there's a sustainability component to this. But of course, if you're able to do this all digitally, you increase the efficiency, can reduce human error. And also, as we mentioned before, there's the downstream and other types of processes in terms of the efficiency of investigations that we mentioned. So you get from really improving your process, the reliability of the process, and reduce the firefighting, because now you can start developing some insights by using some of the digital data. And also, as we've mentioned, being able to meet all of the regulatory requirements from a compliance standpoint, not only from the regulatory bodies, but also from internal quality requirements, and making sure that you comply with all of the different standards and SOPs that you have internally to make sure that you do meet the quality and safety measures that we all need. So when we look at, how do we create, standard platforms and get to that point where we have this shared common, what Nick's shown with all the circles in one place. One area that we've seen that we could start with is this ASTM standard for sharing of raw material information between suppliers and sponsors and manufacturers. It's ASTM 3077-17, and this is what we've started to use within MilliporeSigma to establish and start the process of creating this standardized platform. And as Morris mentioned, not everybody's at the same point. So, you still might have people that are still producing PDFs, CSV files, and so forth. What the 3077-17 allows us to do is go right to XML, more of a structured data format. If you're not able to do that, then there's maybe some ways that you can still move and take steps towards achieving and getting that structured data format that's really required. in the long run. So we're looking also at additional standards and what are the things that might need to be added to existing standards to make sure that we can build on this platform. So it's a good starting point. It's not perfect, but it allows us to start creating the C of A's, having genealogy in place, adding additional test data as needed, and then help to support other partners as they move through the maturity levels that's required to get to this point. So next slide, please. So another key point here is with digital is the ability to automate the process. And in this case, we're talking about not only ingesting it, but also how do you automate the creation of these files. And then from a perspective of the supplier, that's something that we focused on and that we're able to do. But you have to be able to do it also from the standpoint of drawing the information from the direct sources of information that where the original data is actually generated. So it can be done. We've shown and proven that it can be done. But it's important because then it also plays into the as you look at extended use cases beyond some of the analytical pieces that we've talked about. When you start using it in place of the PDFs, then you have to have it fully validated and GMP compliant. So when you look at the automated process, you have to be able to, again, create and collate from your sources and also provide this information on an automated basis to the receivers. And by having this ongoing sharing of this information, this allows you to do some of the things that we've talked about previously in terms of trending, using the data for analytics so that you can actually improve and build more of a predictive system so that you can offset and keep your process running and keep the variability low in your overall process.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for giving us a quick overview of some of the benefits of this. We actually have a Disco Vision publication, I've put it into the chat, which thinks about the whole issue of how you work with another person, another company in a digital way. But I've spotted a couple of things coming up in the chat, and I'd like to invite Chris Evans and Timothy Mayer to come on the call, along with Morris and the others who have been some authors. Could you show your video if you're able to? And I just wanted to pick up a point that's come up because you've been talking about what you'd most like to see with certificates. Timothy mentioned several different good points, one about multiple formats, one about matching, and then the third one about barcodes. And then I noticed that Chris also picked up on that point about barcodes by wondering if there's potential for QR codes to replace C of A. Now that hasn't come up in our conversation. I just wondered, Chris, if you'd just like to explain your thinking there, and then maybe some of the others respond. We're going to go a couple of minutes, but let's do it now.
Yeah, thank you, and nice to meet everybody. It's so I'm Chris. I'm from Cognizant. I used to work in pharma, in manufacturing, and also for contract tester, so I'm quite familiar with the ins and outs of C of A's, and it just had me thinking back to my days in blood transfusion when they introduced a standard ISBT barcode, and that replaced a lot of the printed information on that, and it was used for concatenation and verification of products. So I thought we're talking about different formats of ways of submitting information from various suppliers. So has there ever been a potential for a standard? It wouldn't apply to every supplier, but if you had the infrastructure, could that be introduced, and then that would be somehow linked to a database either at the supplier that used the standard data table?
Yeah. And you guys, what have you seen, or what do you think of that suggestion? Have we ever seen barcodes on any C of A's? Anybody?
It's certainly a fascinating idea. Effectively, the key is to get to a structured data set that you can rely on. Linking, you can imagine that one of the things you have to do is to link that data set to the physical goods that arrive in a warehouse. And you can imagine that having that embedded via a QR code could be useful. Certainly, I think the challenge is to be able to link the physical good to the actual correct data set, and that it certainly could be a mechanism to get there.
I'm not sure about barcodes, but I have seen some companies actually have their CFAs available online that you can go in and put in your lot number and get the CFA. Certainly, a QR code could link you to that page.
Heather, you need to produce lots of these things. So as a producer, what do you see as some of the things in the process? You tell us a bit about that. Go ahead.
I'd like to start by reviewing the specific content that's in a CFA. So it can be in the back of all of our minds when we talk about how we create the document. I see the CFA as having three major areas of content. The first section includes what we'd all consider to be master data, describing the general characteristics of a material, such as the manufacturer, where and when it was produced, along with some sort of product identification or catalog number. Then it's followed by one or many sections of analytical testing results, and these are generally grouped by the sample or the process step, and each line includes a reference to both the analysis and who performed the work. In my experience, where the content starts to get the most variables in the CFAs that we create is in the results column. This content can be textual in nature, so pass or fail, or description like you see here where the first result reads colorless. You should expect to see numeric values like percentages or scientifically expressed numbers with units. And then in this example, the specification limit precedes the results just to outline the acceptable ranges for the various parameters to ensure that the product meets quality and safety standards. Some CFAs also then include another column that explicitly notes whether or not the result falls into that acceptable range. Next slide. So if you scroll down a little farther on the example CFA, you'll see more analysis content and then the remaining section of critical content, which is the certificate statement. The CFA's key purpose is to state that the named batch of material fulfills the specification criteria for the recipient. So in this statement section, we need to identify the name of the authorized person who approved the entire analysis and identify pretty clearly if any part of the record has been corrected. Next slide. All right, so now we know what's inside the CFA from a content perspective. I'll share how they're created primarily from my viewpoint as a CDMO, a manufacturer of finished goods. So the process is pretty simple. You gather the evidence, you review and approve it to then archive or retain the proof of that evidence and share it with chain of custody activities for the physical product. In our digital plant maturity level 3 or higher facilities, this first step of gathering the evidence to support certificate claims can be highly automated. And it can be performed through the engagement of one or many digital solutions that you may have at your site. Most commonly, this is done in your enterprise resource planning tool, your laboratory information management system, or your quality management system. However, it's not always the case that all the required CFA evidence is readily available in one of those systems, and instead a quality team member needs to physically start collecting the evidence for the claim. And that's the primary constraint in this part of the process, is simply the manner in which analytical results are available for the CFA creator. Analysis done by outside laboratories provided by raw material suppliers, as we've heard, is generally available only in PDFs. And while a structured PDF could be used to unlock the contents of these electronic records, it requires the creation and maintenance of logic, basically, to parse that. At Resilience, tabular data is totally a first-class citizen, so we have experienced a lot with the complexity that is managing those types of inputs, and it's really based on the variability of their format or the use of merged cells, and we try to limit that as much as is pragmatic. And then in the far right, the last case is when this in-process or critical to quality data is really only available in physical written records that are created during the manufacturing process. So your paper batch record. These can be scanned to create what would be called an electronic record, but that rarely provides like a high quality output. Various BPIT member companies have shared their experiences to extract data from written records through optical character recognition with AI and ML. My colleagues at Resilience in data engineering have used the AWS Extract service as well. But we've yet to demonstrate that any output would meet the high confidence level that would be needed to support GXP activity like we're talking about now. So what often happens then is that all of these information from physical and electronic records is transcribed into some template that's being used by the creator of the C of A. Next slide. So now we've gathered all of the content, all the various analytical results that are the components of the C of A. The next step is to review that content for completeness and accuracy and also provide the certificate statement. So here our creator is building their report, is building their PDF. And the review process of that can happen in a couple of scenarios, right? So first review could simply mean printing this and creating a physical copy of the PDF and applying a wet signature. And that would then be the attributable copy of the C of A that would need to be retained for both, organizational policies and regulatory retention. The PDF could be electronically signed through the use of an application like Adobe or DocuSign, so some of those common legal applications. And then here the signature becomes a visible mark in an unchangeable PDF that can be viewed when the document is opened by one of the systems, showing who was logged into the application at that time. Alternatively, electronic signatures can be provided as a feature in some of the other systems we talked about, your ERP or your LIMS. And this, when combined with the organization's identification provider, can allow for C of A and review and approval to happen all in one place in the creating system. Usually this requires that the user re-enter their credentials immediately before attestation and signature to verify that the signature is being applied by its genuine owner and not the result of a previous login or a stale session. And then lastly, to support this digitally native C of A that we're talking about, we'd like to be able to apply what's called a digital signature, where a digital signature is an electronic signature that has cryptographic methods of originator authentication so that it can identify both the signer of the data set and the integrity of the data. So to support this auto ingestion methodology that we've been talking about, an application could use something like a private key to establish both that the data has not been altered and that it comes from the original originator that we would expect before it would be brought into a system and shown to a user. Anything else would be flagged as an error. Next slide. As Nick described earlier, the C of A is the key document for establishing confidence among suppliers and contract manufacturers and sponsors in the identification and usability of products in the marketplace. So I've shared how we would create that initial C of A for one of our sponsor organizations, but it's important to note that that's never the final or only version of a C of A. So the C of A I create is shared with one of my sponsors, and they use through their internal processes, review that information. They can either reaffirm it, they can reformat it, they can transcribe it into their standard templates or a template required for the market. But they might also need to append that through the merging of PDFs or incorporating other analytical information, and again, transcription into this final template that is suited for the recipient. So it's this continued review and reformatting of a C of A that limits the process. It's really limited by what happens at the creation of those results. Formatting and signature requirements by customs agencies and health authorities also currently limit our vision of the digitally native C of A in the value chain. We know that there are at least 20 countries that still require wet signatures and physical documents at chain of custody events. And then the last constraint I'll highlight is that any technology that we use in the creation and sharing of a digital C of A also needs to create a human readable format so that it can be consumed by health practitioners and patients at time of use. So to achieve this vision of the digital C of A, it's really important to focus on the digitization of records at their time of creation. Next slide. So I'll end here on a reshare of what Roland shared that shows the use of COAs to emphasize how the creation and sharing process increases the level of complexity throughout the product's lifecycle. As mentioned, we've identified at least 11 unique COAs to demonstrate how the master data and the analytical content from previous versions is continually reprocessed with high-touch human activities. So next, Jer and David will review some of the immersion data standards and some data modeling options that have the potential to unlock these valuable data sets from traditional document-based mechanisms to make them more shareable amongst all parties.
Thank you, Heather. And there's actually quite a lot more detail in the process where that came from. You just chose one section. It happened to be the section that was going wild in the chat with conversations. Could I invite Jason and Holden Harris to come on the call just to make your points verbally, if you could take a short break for that. That's Jason Chatu, by the way, and Holden Harris. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Hi, it was actually a quick question. I'm so happy to see movement towards a digitally native C of A. I think personally it's more compliant. Systems are more robust and it leads to better compliance. I was just wondering if anyone has had experience with regulatory authorities and the acceptance of these digitally native eCofAs. So, for example, from my experience, authorities have had quite strict and variable requirements, even within regulatory agencies, around the use of, for example, signature standards and data integrity. And from data integrity, I'm coming from a compliance point of view, Alcoa plus. Yeah, so that was just my question. What are the risks and what have the inputs been from the regulatory authorities?
Who'd like to have a go at that from the panel?
So I gave an answer there just to say that, look, ultimately we have to have absolute confidence that the data on a certificate is accurate. So there are some difficulties where some local boards of health have written into their law that they expect you to have handwritten signatures and we're going to have to deal with paper certificates. But in general, we have moved into a world where regulators are very confident with electronic signatures, with having audit trails. So it's really about your overall process. So long as you GMP qualify the extraction of the data from the data sources, that you put it into your whatever document it is, can be a search, can be any other kind of document, that you label it up appropriately and then you maintain it that way. So once you've signed it off, you make sure you have an audit trail on it. It turns out to be very acceptable to most of the major regulators around the world. And I'll come on a little bit about how that paradigm is actually driving us now to adopt these sort of techniques more and more.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And Holden was going to point out about the technique in E3077. You can see his comment. But Jer, since you're nearly there, why don't you take a moment just to look over some of those emerging standards and also tell us why it's so important to you when you're at it.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jer Kierans. I lead a group providing quality business solutions and data analytics to Pfizer's global supply chain. So today what I want to talk to you about is some of the standards that currently exist and some of the ways in which we're exchanging data between ourselves and what we're learning, what's working, but what are also opportunities to improve. So again, we've been talking about this standard ASTM 3077-17, and this is a standard we've had since around 2017 using XML extensible markup language, which defines different information concepts on a cert. So this is the name of the material, this is the batch number, this is the name of the test that we've run, this is the value, this is the unit of measure, this is the date of manufacturer, signature, etc., etc. So it allows you to define all of those information concepts in a way that is machine readable. And so, for example, if somebody sends you in a digital certificate of analysis, you can use automation then to drive a decision to say, immediately release this material for use in manufacture. It doesn't need a human to go in and look at it. You can just say release. Or you could extract the data out of the cert and actually put it into a charting node, so you can see how the various lots you've been getting in over the last couple of years have been varying. So you can see, is that in control? But even more so, you could take that data set and then compare it with your own manufacturing data and say, oh, are these raw material inputs driving some sort of outcome in my process? Does it drive better or worse yields? Does it drive a level of an impurity or the size of my molecule, etc., etc.? So when it's locked in on paper, or when it's locked in PDF, someone either has to manually type it into some other model to do the analysis. You can get fancy using some scripts maybe to scrape a standard document and populate it, but to qualify that for GMP use might be difficult. But all in all, if you actually have a markup standard, it means all those information concepts are readily usable for anything else you want to do with them, all right? So that's that standard, and it was developed by some of the people on this work stream, and it's informing a lot of our thinking. You know, we're just trying to extend it and see where else can we do it. Now, then between sponsor companies and CDMOs, we've different means of actually exchanging information. Sometimes it's just a simple spreadsheet, a flat file of CSV data. Please send us a spreadsheet once a month with this is what you're going to label across the columns, and this is how you're going to label the rows and all that good stuff. So it can be like that. You can have people just sending queries of data coming out of your ERP systems, out of your LIMS systems, and sending that over. Some CDMOs actually set up portals because they're saying, look, we want to have one standard interface to talk to our customers, but you then have to align with the CDMO standards and then configure that for your own company's needs. So ultimately, we've lots of different standards. What would be really useful is that this information that we're transferring, because it's all kind of the same stuff, the information types that we're exchanging, that if we all labeled it up the same way, then we'd all understand what we're all saying, and we could send these machine readable information to each other much more readily. The problem is, and I'm going to blame the sponsor companies, but basically everybody wants everybody else to standardize with our standards. Do it the Pfizer way, do it the Merck way, do it the Roche way, do it the Lonza way, and then ultimately no one really standardizes too much across the entire industry. If we could find a way to do that, that would be a great thing. However, there is somebody who can actually make us all pay attention and adopt a similar standard, and that's the regulator. And you might be saying, do we send certificates of analysis into the regulator? It's the same information concepts that are on your certs that we send in regulatory filings. We send in, this is the material. These are batch IDs. These are how we test, this is the tests. These are the values. So from the regulator's point of view, they've been tasked, like, how can you speed up the overall rate at which you are reviewing filings? Because it's the gating, it's the gating milestone for all these sponsor companies to get a return on the product development investment they've been putting in for many years. So they're under pressure to get that review done faster. Like one of the recent filings I would have been involved in would have had 64,000 pages to review. Think about it. How many humans have to read that and do it accurately? Because the regulators also have a public healthcare responsibility to make sure they're asking the right questions. Has the product been developed properly? Is there any inherent risk to patients before they give you a license to manufacture this and distribute to the public? So that is why they're now driving. It's the FDA were doing it first, but the EMA, the Japanese PMDA, TGA in Australia, Swissmedica, Health Canada, HPRA in Ireland, they're all coming on board saying we need to have a data standard for the information concepts that go into pharmaceutical quality and regulatory documents so that we can automate that and use machine learning algorithms to develop queries to send back in much faster time in future. So on the next slide, you'll see that the filings that we send in to the regulators are, it's defined. There's lots of different modules, and the desire now is that we'll actually develop a data standard for each one of these modules so that it can be, you can send in submissions that are machine readable by the regulator. Okay, so the one that we're really interested in is module 3. This is to do with pharmaceutical quality and regulatory information. So it's the information like how do you manufacture your batch, how do you test it, how do you validate it, your stability analysis, your lot genealogies, things like that. So all of those terms, your batch formulation, they're all going to be defined and marked up in a standard way. So we send the information in, the regulator is going to be able to instantly be able to understand what you've sent it and handle it with confidence. All right. So that's what we're going to get in the future. At the moment, we think we're doing digital submissions, but they're just flat PDFs. As I said, when they get really big, that's still just a human rights issues for lots of humans to go and review it. So in the future, if we can send in a marked up machine readable data, then suddenly we're going to open up a whole new world of productivity. On the next slide, then I'll show you that what's happening now is what's development of these data standards. So there's one that's being developed based on FHIR standards for the internet. There's a data standards group called HL7, and they're working with a consortium of many of the major pharmaceutical sponsor companies to define how are we going to call all these different information concepts and agree on a common terminology. All right. So if I just go through this flowchart left to right, over on the left, we have all our data input systems. So this could be inside or outside the sponsor company. It could be the CMOs. It's your LIMS systems, your ERPs. It could be manufacturing execution systems. There's lots of systems where we need to extract data. Then we're going to aggregate it into digitized content, and we'll transform it into different leaflets. We'll say, this is the history of the manufacturing of the batch. This is how we have justified our specifications. This is how we do our stability analysis. That information is then marked up and sent through the cloud in a machine readable format that's received by the regulator. So they now ingest it very quickly. They will be checking, have you put all the right information in that we expect? How did you justify your specs? Oh, that spec looks far too wide. I expect you to narrow it. And then it'll go through and see, oh, based on all this other information, there seems to be a bit of a risk that you have too many particles. Can you please tell me how you're going to address the level of particles you've seen today? Those sort of queries will come back automatically. And then over time, they're going to store our data and they'll build up a history of both the way we're doing it and other companies, and they'll just get smarter and smarter and give us tougher and tougher questions. But that's just the way it works. And so fundamentally, what this FHIR data standard is doing, it's going to provide you, like, it's basically FHIR's like one of these roadmaps of the internet. It solves for a problem called interoperability. And interoperability is about how easy is it for me to find information and use it. So it has to be marked up. It has to be, I have to have confidence. I don't have to check with somebody. Is this actually the right test result? Is this the right batch? Is this the right material? No, because it's marked up, you have absolute confidence that this is being done in the right way. It's a bit like these FHIR standards have existed for other industries. Take the airline industry, right? So when you right now, you got all these apps. So they have a FHIR standard that defines the information concept for, you know, your seat, for flight number, for your time for takeoff. And that's why all the information that all these different apps can be easily developed, and we can just see the information flowing from airports to airlines to other third parties with ease because it's all marked up properly. That doesn't exist yet in healthcare, but that's what we want to do. So once we have defined all these information concepts, we're going to be able to exchange information much more readily, with much more ease, and to the data integrity questions with absolute confidence that it is what it's being marked up to be. So on the next slide, where are we at in terms of this? This is a multi-year project. This will go on for the rest of the decade, but we're at a very exciting point where this data exchange pharmaceutical and quality data standard will be issued. The first version for module 3 is going to be issued by the end of 2023. And then, because this is going to be mandated, it's being defined by the regulator, you will mark this up like that. It's likely to drive a general adoption of this standard across the industry. All right. So if we can predict the data, the data that's going to be required, the question is, why would we have different ways of marking up our data inside our own companies? We should be looking to adopt the same terminology, the same way of marking up information, so that it's easy to find the same information concepts within our own companies. So there's a bit of an education job to be done here to make everyone aware of this new standard and to make sure we all align. So, you know, you don't invest in a new system that's out of, and you miss the opportunity. So this is coming. It's imminent. But how do we get from where we are now to that new world that I said? So we have a lot of existing data standards within our company. We have ASTM 307717. And how does that map onto this new DXPQ standard? So that's what we got to do next.
Thank you for that. And Ger also has to leave in 2 minutes. So Ger.
Yeah. So if we talk about it's really about how do we get everybody to agree on the same data standard? And that's been the challenge for us. Everybody wants everybody else to align with us. However, there is a force in the universe that's powerful enough to get us all to align, and that's the regulator. So the FDA in particular, but really all of them, they want to have a fully machine readable regulatory filing that can they can just completely machine read it, and then they'll be able to use algorithms to analyze it and send us back questions straight away. To do that, they need to define all the information concepts within the filing. And right now, from next month, I believe it's on schedule now, that the FHIR standard that will define all the information concepts in module 3 of the electronic common technical document that is now going to be approved and will be revised up over the next year. So we're on the cusp of having like a pharmaceutical quality Esperanto, who will be able to talk to each other with machines, so that and they will understand what the concepts are that we're talking about.
And all of that is an update since we recorded it. So things are actually moving fast. What?
Yes.
In the pharmaceutical industry, things moving fast? What is the world coming to? Thank you for that update. Ger very memorably told me about asking some of his data scientists to find a correlation between some paper and PDF CDAs and some yield. And they told him to get stuffed because it's too difficult. We need this to be data. And I've also got fond memories of working with David Brick, who's our next speaker, and the others around a giant wall chart full of data items combining everyone's experience. David's very passionate about this. And without giving too much technical detail, here's his stuff on the things we need to specify to get a digital way forward in this area.
I'm David Brick. My background is in statistics, and I've been building and implementing software to aggregate and analyze pharmaceutical manufacturing data for a bit over 20 years now. Many people will acknowledge that variability in input materials can have dramatic effects on the quality and yield of their final products. I've seen a case where variability in process step 6 showed a really strong correlation to the yield and the quality results way downstream in step 23. But that's something that's very difficult for someone to find. It's difficult to see those relationships if you have to assemble all that data manually. Without easy access to linking the raw material data and the product data, the analysis is just a time-consuming manual challenge that rarely gets prioritized. Process experts need to capture the data to document their processes and batches, but they also need to analyze data within the process context for better process understanding, for process optimization, and probably most time-consuming to investigate production issues. So for each of these activities, access to an organization of the data is critical. Working in software companies focused on biotech and pharma manufacturing data, I've seen a lot of data structures, some common, many custom built or configured. And what I've come to recognize is that the requirements for those structures are frequently driven by what's available and what's convenient, with a hope that will meet the data user's needs. Unfortunately, what's available and what's convenient varies from partner to partner, site to site, product to product, and even within a product that's produced at multiple sites or even on just different lines. The thing is, with all that variation, still the end user's needs are the same. That's where standardizing the definition of product quality data will make a huge difference in digital enablement. If data sets are easy to generate and easy to consume, that data can be readily available to quality and process experts for their analytical needs. They don't have to go through the extensive manual processes to pull it all together. So a usable and useful data model needs to include a few things. An entity relationship model. What are the things? What is the real world and how are they related? A logical data model, which applies the structure of the data points and the metadata. A data dictionary that defines what each item means. And a controlled and shared terminology that gets us talking exactly the same language with the data. As we look at the existing and proposed models, which are all different, of course, we felt that it was important to get back to some core principles. Excuse me. Number one, use a model that represents the real world uses of the data. This keeps the model easy to comprehend and usually easier to create and consume. So that's critical for digital enablement. Number two, focus on the one-to-many relationships. If you ignore those relationships and those structures, you end up with a model that gets used in different ways and people kind of go different directions with it. So it requires extra definition and extra interpretation way too often. And three, recognize that partners sharing data are at different maturity levels, different digital maturity levels. So the approach should support both machine optimized and person or user optimized approaches. To find a way forward that makes the data easy to generate and easy to consume, we started looking at the ASTM E307717 standard. We see that that's used by some companies, but we also looked at some things that were done by other companies, and what we saw was Company A had kind of an internally defined model. Company B had a very different approach with a shared CSV structure that partitioned the data into several layers. Company C actually tried to follow the ASTM standard, but they needed to supplement that with additional files. And as Jer mentioned, we have started looking at what's coming from the both PQCMC and the DXPQ standards that are coming out. So not surprisingly, we found a lot of variation as we looked at this. But if we look at this chart, we also can see that it is possible to line up a lot of these models, and there are a lot of similarities there. So we looked at the ASTM standard and how some companies were using it and others weren't. And we determined that we really needed a model that goes a little beyond the scope for that. And we want to build something that converges on a common standard that can be used for all cases if possible. As we look at the logical data model, the data points within those structures, we found a number of fields in the real world CFAs that were not covered by the E3077, or they might be optional fields, and those may be represented inconsistently from one company to the next. So we wanted to build something that's a little more strictly defined structure to minimize that inconsistency and the need to provide interpretation of those fields. The model needs to allow for additional data that might be omitted from the printed CFA. Well, a printed CFA generally is focused on the values with specifications. Support for additional fields and additional detailed data can really help with downstream analytics and process understanding. So we really kind of wanted to define something where, while the CFA may include certain fields, once it's delivered electronically, additional fields can be included in that and made available for analytic and reporting purposes. We also need to support additional data transfer formats. They're easier for generation and consumption. As we look at the varying levels of digital maturity and some of the things that are coming from the emerging standards, there's some need to go beyond just XML and what we support there. The data model that we constructed here was based on the E3077, so we could stay close to that standard, but it also brought in some concepts from the other real world models from specific companies and from some of the newer standards. Our next step is really to go back and do some more review of this against those emerging standards and make sure we're in sync and what we learn from that. The next slide is really covers the data dictionary, which is kind of the next to last piece here. The data dictionary provides a definition of what each field in the data model means, and importantly, what is optional and what is not. It can be used as a standard configuration, but it can also be used as a framework for discussion between partners if a variation is needed and if they need to align on what data may be optional and how data is presented. The data dictionary can also include a list of permissible values. Those are really a controlled terminology. The terminology can be defined by one partner or as a joint effort between partners, but it ensures consistency and supports clear definitions. The Thanks, David. These tables are on the slide here are from the DXPQ standard. And it goes much farther in some of the definitions than E307717 and sets out some local standards for how things are communicated, how things are captured in the data. So for all the data model fans out there, I've got 17 more slides of tables to look at. Just kidding.
Stop. It's enough to have the overview, but we will be publishing some of this as really our input to this ongoing discussion. And clearly with PQCMC coming along, we want to get involved in that discussion to make that useful to everyone. Thank you for the comments and questions that are coming in. We'll pick those in just after Santul has shared a bit of his experience and also some of the considerations about realizing this in the real world. Go ahead, Santul.
Right. Thank you, David. So my name is Santul Sharma. I'm working for Lonza in the digital data integration team. And our team is primarily focused on executing the digital integrations between the different partners that we're working with. And that's typically where realizations comes into the equation. So if you move to the next slide, David. So realizations typically deal with the physical implementations of the data integration use case. And based on our experiences, we've learned that digital maturity and digital integration are intertwined. And digital maturity typically drives digital integration and is probably a precursor to digital integration as you go along. Now, when you talk about digital maturity per se, I would further like to break it down into two different facets. The first one is digitization. Some of my colleagues have already spoken about it, about OCR, ML, and how data can be digitized. And the second one are the core patterns that you employ to perform digital integrations with your partners in the ecosystem. What you typically notice is that organizations that master these two traits end up rising the ladder that you see here on the screen right now. And typically, the sweet spot of this ladder would be anywhere within the phases 3 and 4, wherein the moment you start sending requests for data integration, the data is automatically extracted and in a higher digital maturity chain, automatically ingested at the other end. So this is typically where you'd want to be once the two fundamental pillars have been taken care of. Now, in terms of the alignment or the actual data integration between the different organizations, the first and the most fundamental thing are the requirements that need to be handled. So once the requirements have been taken care of, the next thing that you need to look at is whether the data has been digitized or not. And this is typically where the Achilles heel of the CoAs actually comes into the equation, wherein most of the data is trapped on paper right now in PDF files. So assuming that we don't go down that route and we look at only the source systems, typically, most organizations these days have their own integration layers in between that can be used to aggregate the data from the source systems. And then once the data has been aggregated, we can then follow a standardized approach wherein we look at the data structure, we look at the output formats, and last but not the least, we also look at the transport protocols that we use to share the data across. In general, what we've learned in our experience at Lonza is that quite a few organizations are still very comfortable in sharing data via SFTP channels. But typically, as you gain digital maturity, especially in terms of your core ability to integrate data within different organizations, you would probably want to move a little towards the right to a REST-based transfer. Because the moment you enable a REST-based transfer, you can pretty much send any payload across. It could be the file itself in a CSV or a PDF format, or it could actually be the XML or the JSON payloads that we've been speaking about in the past. Next slide, David. Thank you. Now, in terms of the output formats, once the data structure has been decided upon and the field names and the nomenclature has been set, as you can see here, we can typically translate the same payload into either an XML or a JSON format, or maybe even send the entire file stream altogether in a CSV or a PDF file as you see fit. But again, it depends on the digital maturity of all the participating organizations in the ecosystem. Next slide, David. Thanks. So one key area that's been more of a learning curve for us at Lonza has been
the need to have multiple realizations. And typically, this has been driven by the fact that when you start working with different kinds of partners, each of those partners may lie at a different digital maturity altogether. Some may face issues with digitization per se and may have all the data trapped on paper, while some of the other ones may not even have core digital data integration patterns to begin with. So it's always a very prudent and a very pragmatic approach to make sure that you have at least 2, if not more, options of integrating data with your partners, depending on the digital maturity of those different partners that you're working with. Now, in terms of more specifically the certificates of analysis, although I would say that this will still be very pertinent to the overall data exchanging use case altogether, once you aggregate the data from the underlying source systems, which will typically be your ERP and LIMS systems in this case, you can create a common data store that could either be a data warehouse or a data lake in the beginning. And then once the data has been sanitized and aggregated together, you can further contextualize it with, depending on the partners that you're working with. So for example, for partner X, you could further contextualize the data from the data lake into a standardized package that could have its own output format, output protocol, and a specific data model that you may be following for that particular implementation. And similarly, for a different partner altogether, you may still use the same standardized package, but the specifics could vary depending on the different kinds of requirements that you're dealing with. What will eventually happen is that once you do sufficient implementations, your data pipelines will start converging and you will start seeing reusable components altogether. And that is the fundamental aspect that we are trying to strive for, that we try and reduce waste as much as possible, converge to a centralized data model, and have standardized ways of sharing data with our partners. And then the next slide, one slide before, David.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and the last bit is again about the different kinds of benefits that we can accrue by bringing this kind of an implementation to the fore. It's not only about reusability, it's also about reducing the complexity, potentially reducing the costs, and most importantly, reducing the maintenance efforts that go into creating bespoke implementations. So that is what we are trying to achieve with some of the data integration platforms that we are building right now. And these themes will continue not only for the certificates of analysis, but also all the other data sources that we work with, typically with, within our own ecosystem, while integrating data with our partners.
So thank you, Santul, and thank you all actually for a marvelous conversation today. We're almost hitting time, so I want to just summarize that Nick has explained to us the context we need to digitize. It's about certificates. Roland pointed out 11 use cases throughout the supply chain, and Morris said data is in a prison if it's on PDF or on paper. But Stephen had a vision for the data being released and so showed some of the benefits of that. And Heather talked about the process for generating that, and particularly touching on the topic of signatures, which came up in the chat quite a lot. Jer was then spotting some emerging standards and not so standards, and the desire for us to harmonize that. So David took a look at how those existing things line up and found that they could be lined up and that there is benefit. We'll do some more of trying to line that up in this team. And Santul has some very pragmatic experience from actually trying to build this stuff with the different partners that he works with. I hope that you find it useful to reflect on that. This is part of what we've been discussing in the DISCO program. I'll just very briefly set on screen the link to our publication, and you've had it a couple of times in the chat already, and leave you with a QR code to follow through if you're wanting to do that on your phone, or contact me with my email address there if you want to take this further. We're sort of hitting towards the end of time, but I do want to give a chance, particularly for some of the people who've been chatting in the verbal chat here to jump in and just have a bit of a conversation with the presenters, because there's some very interesting points comparing stuff from other industries coming out most recently. Bill, I don't know if you're able to join us, or if some of you guys who are presenters have been reading those and would like to respond, even if you can't join the conversation. If you are joining, switch your camera on. So we're going to run on for a bit, but we'll say that's the end of the formal presentation, and now we'll just chat as long as it takes. Thank you. So guys on the call, parallels from other industries. This one about the software industry having to track the software product, which is itself digital, as well as the certificate being digital. Interesting, different. Anybody want to comment? Anything that struck you afresh as you were listening to your own voices speaking, or to each other's voices again, since we recorded?
I'm just going to add one thing, David, that one of the things we're continuing to explore, and as promised, is that there can be a difference between a scanned PDF and a structured PDF, and that we see a number of suppliers who are generating a PDF, for example, out of SAP, and that it is possible to extract the data from that as if it was a structured data format. So there may be a significant difference between those who are scanning a document on their printer or whatever and sending that over, and it's crooked and there's handwritten annotations, etc., that there may be a world apart from those who are already generate a structured PDF, which can actually be converted to a JSON or an XML file with a lot more ease and without the use of OCR. So just a nuance that maybe wasn't covered.
That's right. Chris has mentioned blockchain as a way of supply chain tracking. Anyone come across that as an option?
Again, David, it's something that we have looked at. Kind of pure blockchain sometimes seems like overkill, but there are other examples of blockchain type technologies, consortia based approaches where you have groups of trusted players rather than a full Bitcoin type of approach. But a lot of the cases where you're looking for demonstrating immutability, you simply need a hash of what was sent rather than necessarily having to go the full blockchain route. But there's potential that we look at within that and are continuing to explore.
And just a point to add to Morris's point is, it's not just the exchange of the information, which could be blockchain, which could be other things, but it's also the underlying structure so that it can be used for additional purposes. Because in many cases, companies may do trend monitoring or product performance on the information that's contained within there. So a lot of our focus is not just on the transmission component, but also the syntax that we're using to capture the structure of the test, the specifications, the results, et cetera, et cetera. So,
and both of those are the conclusions we came to, that blockchain was a bit overkill for audit records and didn't meet the needs for accessibility to the data for analytic purposes. So, reiterating what both Nick and Maurice said.
But the other point coming out of Nick's statement there is that it's not just about getting the process to flow smoothly for this one batch. It's also about giving that broader set of data and connecting it all so that you can spot like the correlation you mentioned, David, between step 6 and 23 or something, wasn't it? And that's only going to be possible if you've got the broadest set of data. Let's see, are there any other thoughts coming in at this point? Okay, so maybe I'll close with the comment made by somebody. Apologies, I've got to go and collect the children. So that does make our actual close of the webinar. All right, cheers then. Bye-bye.